So thank you again for coming out. This is our Rise of the Residential first walking tour that we're doing. We're going out into the Hough neighborhood today, and we'll be looking at a series of homes and a few businesses and whatnot. And we just want to thank everyone for coming out, because the purpose of the museum is to collect the county's history and to have that history, on display for the public. But also what we want to do is we want to make sure to interpret that history. And that's what these tours are about, is about interpreting the history and bringing out these different sites alive and talking about just different people and individuals that have lived in the community that have done different things and have lived interesting lives that we've been able to uncover. So we'll go ahead and start here at the museum real quick, and I'll go through this and let you know what this building originally was. This was originally a Carnegie library, and it was built in 1909. And this was built by a local construction person named Ole Larson. His company built it. And this was the first public library in the city of Vancouver. And this was built with a $10,000 grant from the Carnegie Foundation. Now, these grants weren't just for libraries nationally, but worldwide. And Carnegie wanted to bring enlightenment to the communities around the nation and around the world. And so he wanted to provide these public libraries. Now, part of the architecture of this library actually represents Carnegie's impression of what these libraries meant. Now, you see these stairs right here that lead up, and they're pretty steep. And Carnegie wanted a nice rising stairway that went into the building to show reverence for this building, that it was lifting people up, it was enlightening people. And then you have the two lights placed off to the side that represent the enlightenment of the community, having this public building available to them. Now, when this building was built, Carnegie stipulated that it was to only be, the $10,000 was to only be for the construction of the building and nothing else. So the land had to be secured ahead of time, and then the company had to, or the community had to provide the money for books and staff and furnishings and whatnot. And actually, a local brick manufacturer, Lowell Hidden, donated this plot of land. This was originally a clay pit. And the clay that was extracted from here was taken across the street and was made into bricks in his brickyard that was across the street. And then the same brickyard that manufactured from this clay, they went ahead and brought bricks back and built this building. So the bricks came home. So originally, yeah, this was a clay pit. And now Hidden, when he gave the land, he made one stipulation, that there must always remain a library in this building, or the land is to revert back to the Hidden family. So we honor that with our research library, which we have in the basement. So no matter what happens to this building at any point, there must always remain a library in it, or the Hidden family will take back the land. The other interesting thing about this building is that when it was first built, it was one of the first buildings in the county with electricity. It was the first public building with electricity. And when the librarians first got into the building, they were kind of nervous about this new electricity thing in 1909. So they went and they had gas lamps installed, and they actually used those for the first several years instead of the electricity. Now, when they first built this, it needed books and stuff put inside, and so the community gathered almost $1,300. Citizens from around gathered almost $1,300 for all the books that needed to be placed into the building. And then the city council provided another $1,500 for furnishings and staff. Now, when this building was originally built, it was designed to hold 25,000 books. And by the 1950s and 60s, it was holding 150,000 books. So it was bursting at the seams. Now, it had two additions put onto it. It had a 1946 edition, which is our back main gallery, and then the center gallery that we have with our Vet Inc. exhibit is actually the one that was put up in 48. So there was some space, but not much. And so the building needed to be repurposed at that point, and the new Vancouver Library was constructed, and this was taken over by the Clark County Historical Society. So from here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start walking down this way, and we're going to get into the neighborhood we're going to talk about today.
Do you want to talk about anything?
Yeah, you want to talk about the...
Yeah, on the corner up here, the green, two-tone green building, those of you who have been around a while probably recognize that building. That was the home of Foley Chevrolet. In the early part of the century, as the automobiles were becoming more important to folks, dealerships found a way to set up shop here in the downtown area. So we had Foley Chevrolet here. We had Marshall Ford. Oh, before that it was, I think, Grandy Ford over on 10th and Washington. Up on 17th and Broadway was, or 18th and Broadway, was Gilbert and Seibel Volkswagen, the first foreign car dealership in Vancouver. And then down on Broadway, 7th and Broadway was Peterson Motors. Those were Chrysler products. So we were all spread pretty close around the core area. It wasn't until the 70s and 80s that the dealerships moved out into auto malls. Across the street, somebody on one of the tours says, you know, Ken, you seem to know a lot about bars. Well, across the street, there was a lumber yard. After Hiddens closed their facility and moved it on out to 27th and Kaufman, there was a huge building there that was a lumber yard. When they closed down, then a tavern went in there called the Red Caboose, and it was there. It was the last business standing over there, and I think their sign is still exists on the lot. So.
And well, Lisa Road, right? Everyone knows Lisa Road.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And Dr. Lisa, wasn't he the first?
Yeah, Dr. Lisa. Interesting story. The Lisa family. There was 3 sons who were all physicians. There was Herbert, Miles, and Ralph. Well, Miles died prematurely from flu in 1918, so Ralph named his son Miles. Well, his son Miles became a dentist, had an office here. We'll see one of his offices next week on the Arnada tour.
Yeah.
But Miles served in World War II in Europe, and he was fascinated with the Volkswagen. So according to Miles, he brought the first Volkswagen back to Vancouver from Europe before we ever opened up this dealership.
Yep, the first foreign car was owned by one of the leasers in the area. We'll go ahead and walk down this way and we'll take a look at our first house. So as we're walking up here, we're gonna go ahead and head up to Columbia Street, and I'll tell you a little bit about this part right here. Before the 1930s, this would have been just nothing. Just would have been empty lots. This whole area, when you look in the directories and you look for addresses, you see between 15th and 19th that there's just streets. So everyone turns around and looks right now, you can actually see the top of St. James Cathedral right over there. And originally, that cathedral was on the site of the Fort Vancouver, Hudson's Bay Company area. And it's St. James. The reason that's named St. James isn't just for the apostle, but it's also for James Douglas, the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company, because he insisted on having the church built there on the Hudson's Bay Company land when they were occupying that property. And then when the military moved in, they asked the church to move, and they purchased the land that they now reside on there.
Have you talked about the names of the streets?
You can.
Okay. Glenn Rank, an early publisher in Vancouver, well-known businessman, he named a lot of the streets here in West Vancouver. He named Columbia after the river. He named Daniels after W. Byron Daniels, an early mayor in Vancouver and a civic leader. He named Esther after Esther Short, of course. Franklin was named after Benjamin Franklin. Grant was named after the general. And Harney was another military leader that was stationed here in Vancouver. So it kind of gives you an idea of where the street names came from. Initially, it was Main Street was A, and it was B, C, D, E, and so on. And Main Street was A, and it went east, B, C, D, and so on. But eventually, we had civic leaders name the streets. In the mid-50s, at a city council meeting, the council renamed several of the streets. So then we have, instead of 18th, we had McLaughlin. Instead of 10th, we had Evergreen. And there were a number of other changes made then.
Which I would call a historian's nightmare, because it's absolutely awful to try and track down, because some people will say, you know, I live on McLaughlin and 13th or something of that. And when we try to track that down, we always have to figure out what the roads were. And sometimes even the roads that go up and down that were named, you know, Columbia or this and that, they had a completely different title, like not one that's not even related to it at all. So it's real interesting. And Vancouver like to move their streets around a lot. So we'll go ahead and stop here and we'll talk about this house. This house was built in 1920, and this in 1931 was the home of prominent architect in Vancouver, Day Hilborn. Hilborn and his wife actually moved in this home around 31, and he's one of the best known architects in the area, and he was a member emeritus of the American Institute of Architecture. And he designed numerous schools, banks, churches, theaters, commercial buildings, and homes all over the Pacific Northwest. Hilborn is the one who actually designed the Camas Library that's out in Camas, Washington. He also designed the Medical Arts Building, which was in 1928 when he designed that. And that was one of his earliest works. And so about that time, as he was rising and he was building that, he was living in this home with his wife. And most of his work is located in Portland, Vancouver, and Centralia, but he also has stuff out in the other county. And his most notable work in Vancouver include the county courthouse, which was built in 41, and he designed that one. The Kiggins Theater, which he designed around 35. The Kiggins Bowl Stadium, which he designed, and then the Federal Savings and Loan, which is now the Chase Bank. And when he designed that one, there was an interesting little excerpt in the paper when they talked about Hilborn designing that. They said that his design and building was as modern as a rocket to the moon. Now, when I walk past that building, if anyone can visualize that building with the big front that has the circle ornamentation and whatnot, I have never been able to find a better explanation of how that building looks as a rocket to the moon. And he also designed the old City Hall, which used to stand at Washington and 8th. Hilborn was actually from Michigan. He was born in 1897, and his family moved to the Seattle area when he was young. And shortly after graduation from high school, he enlisted in the Army, and he ended up serving in France in World War I. And while he was over in France, Hilborn actually sent home sketches of the architecture and different elements that he saw over there. And he became very passionate about the buildings and architecture. And so he actually went and got a structural engineering degree from Washington State College, Pullman, now Washington State University. And he graduated and then moved to Vancouver in 1927. And in 1927, when he moved to the area, this is where he was living. A year later, he married his wife Dorothy White, and she was actually a principal and an instructor at Woodland, Washington. And he and Dorothy had 2 daughters and a son, and the most notable of his creative works were done at his office on Evergreen. He died in 1971 at the age of 74, and he was an especially well-rounded individual. He was quite involved in his church and different community organizations. And the Salvation Army building, which is down on 11th and Evergreen, it's no longer the Salvation Army building, but it was at one time the Salvation Army building. He actually donated the majority of his services to the design of that building because he believed in the cause that the Salvation Army provided so much. And so he was quite an interesting character and very civic. Now, his favorite building, Hilborn's favorite structure that he built, was the Spick and Span drive-through. Does anyone remember the Spick and Span? Yeah, he used to love going to the Spick and Span, and he would go in there and he would sit down and he would draw away and design and whatnot. And he was known in the community, but this was back in the day when you knew of someone, you knew their name, but you didn't necessarily know their face. And so he's down there with a hamburger one day in one hand and drawing pencil in another. And some individual comes up to him and he's furiously, sketching out a drawing. And he says, "Who do you think you are? Day Hilborn?" And Hilborn, a very modest man, just turns around and looks and goes, "Yes, yes I am." And he said that was one of his most favorite structures that he ever designed. And so that was very interesting. And so Hilborn spent his formative years as an architect in this house right here. And this is an interesting house because it's an English Tudor style home. And so it has a little bit of different elements than you see in a lot of different homes in Vancouver. From here, we'll go ahead and walk up and we'll take a look at our next site. And as we walk down here, I'll just point out, for last week's tour, you see the back of this building here. This was originally the Holland Creamery. It was owned by Jacob Jack Propstra. And his son, who eventually took over the family business because they eventually put a restaurant out front, decided to open up a small little burger shack that he called Burgerville.
That same thing.
So this building right here that you're looking at, this building was built around 1930, and it's remained the site of an auto repair shop the entire time of its existence. And the first owner of the shop was Fred Meridian and his wife Josephine. And Josephine actually worked as a clerk in Fred's shop because Fred had been working as a foreman for Shattuck Motors, and was actually moving up in the world at this time, and he decided to go out and strike out into the business on his own. And Fred was doing that during an interesting time, because during the period that Fred opened up this shop was the beginning period when they started to incorporate fenders into cars. So before this period, you didn't have the fender, and they also began to develop the closed body car during this time. So he was actually running his business during a time when technology was changing. And the other thing that they began to incorporate during this period too in automobiles that Fred had to deal with was the trunk. So before, you didn't have storage, you had an open body, and you had no fender. And the side note on this is that during this period in the 1930s and 40s, when they were doing this and they were incorporating these things, most of the items that are on the modern automobile now were developed and designed during this time. So from here, we'll go and head up and we'll take a look at one of our first houses. And as we walk, I'll just point out, we see the church up there, which was originally a First Christian church. And that congregation no longer worships there. They actually now are in the back, this building here that was built in the 1950s. So the congregation is still around, but they're in a new building. And that's actually, over the years, if you look at a lot of local church groups in downtown Vancouver, that's tended to happen where they've moved out of the downtown area or they've moved into smaller locations as a lot of the congregations have aged. They've relocated. Now this house, just to start off a little bit, architecturally is kind of interesting because this is a craftsman style home, but this is called an arts and crafts style craftsman. And it just has the different overhangs, and it's kind of more of a symmetrical shape than a lot of the other homes. And then the bottom part here is a little off center. But this house is the Collings house, and this was actually built in 1910. So now if anyone remembers last week, when we walked up Main Street, we saw the Collings building with the Collings name on it. Well, the individual that owned the grocery store in that building lived in this house right here. And this house was built in 1910, and upon its completion, Arthur J. Collings and his wife resided here, and they remained in this home until the 1940s. And Collings was a local businessman. He owned a grocery store at 1901 Main in a building that bears his family's name. And the Collings family was actually fairly prominent in Vancouver. His father, Abraham Collings, was actually a bailiff for the Superior Court, the local Superior Court in the area. And he was also heavily involved in community activities. One such activity that's noted that he was involved in was organizing the Old and Young Veterans and Women's Relief Corps for Decoration Day in 1911. Now, this was part of a custom of casting roses on the surface of the Columbia River in memory of the sailors that had passed away. And so this was a quite thing. And this was also something, Decoration Day, that had become popular after the Civil War also. And Abraham Collings and J.A. Snodgrass were appointed to arrange the program. And it was set to involve the Grand Army veterans. Does anyone know who the Grand Army veterans were? They were the veterans group for the Northern Union soldiers from the Civil War. And in the library, or in the museum, that group actually used to have their meetings in our basement before there were enough books to fill it. They allowed the Grand Army individuals to go in there and actually have their meetings. And it's rumored that it was kind of a scuffle to get them out when the time came. And then also the Women's Relief Corps was to be involved, the Spanish-American War veterans and the Sons of Veterans groups. And it was set for Memorial Day. And there was to be a march from the public library, which was the museum at the time, all the way down to the city park at 1:30 p.m. on that day. And Snodgrass and Collings also arranged for A.D. Skaggs, Reverend A.D. Skaggs, which we mentioned last week was the marrying parson of the Northwest Granada Green, to do an oration for the day. Now, there was another Collings that was also involved in the festivities for that day too, Clyde Collings, which was the grandson of Abraham and the son of Arthur's brother. And Clyde had actually stayed out in Vancouver for a little while. His family lived in Ridgefield, but he stayed with his grandparents, and so he was out here with them. And he actually went and did a rendition of the Gettysburg Address for the festivities of that day. And Clyde actually went on to prominence. Back in the early 40s and 50s, they used to have these publications called Who's Who in Washington. And they would put just prominent figures' name. And Clyde actually made it into it. He was a prominent urologist, and he went and did his residency at Bellevue Hospital in New York, and then came back and was a urologist at St. James for many years. So this house here had a very prominent family that was tied to it, the Collings, and is just a great example of some of those historic homes that we have left in the area. So from here, we'll go ahead and walk up and we'll take a look at our next site.
You know, I want to point out this house here. It's got a gambrel type roof on it, and this is often referred to as Dutch colonial. And you'll find several Dutch colonials in Hough and in Arnada. So next week we'll see a number of Dutch colonials there as well. I don't know anything about the history of this house, but I love the style. Okay. This house across the street, beautiful house. It's often referred to as four-square architecture. Very functional. The buildings are square. They tend to have dormers with dormered roof section on them. And those are typical from about 1900 to 1915.
So here we come up to our next house, and this is actually the style Ken was just talking about. This is close to the Dutch colonial style here. And this is 2009 Washington Street. And this is the Hough-The house. It's a bit of a tough name to say. Now, George Hough-The was a local auto dealer and politician from Ridgefield, Washington. And Hough-The was born in the county in Ridgefield in 1883. He was a county commissioner from 1922 until 1928, and he was a member of the Ridgefield Masonic Lodge. So he was quite prominent individual in the Ridgefield community. Now, his first race for county commissioner was in 1922, and he ran for district number 1. And today, district number 1 covers the Ridgefield northern area of the county and then also out to Camas and Washougal. And he was opposed by one Frank Davis, and Hough-The won the election by only 53 votes. The total count was 3,841 to 3,788, so it was quite a close race. And he took office on January 8th of 1923, and he went and he did his business as the county commissioner, and he won re-election again in 1926. Now, upon his re-election, he had something that he ended up having to deal with the other commissioners. See, Hough-The was elected the chairman of the board of the county commissioners, and during this period of time, the commissioners were looking to try and find a way to get the tolls taken off of the I-5 bridge. Now, I know we don't have anything to say about tolls because, you know, we don't have those right now. So what they did is they devised a plan that they would try to sell their share of the bridge for $250,000 to the state of Washington so that the tolls could be lifted. Now, it seems there was a little bit of a skirmish over this idea. And so at one point, as they were trying to proceed for a vote of the public to do this, they actually rescinded the date that they had planned and postponed it because they were having some trouble getting support for this idea. However, by 1928, Hough-The and the other commissioners were able to finally get it passed and through. And just as he was leaving office, him and the other commissioners signed the order to have the bridge sold for $250,000 to the state of Washington. And so on January 1st, 1929, people were able to drive across the I-5 bridge, or the interstate bridge at the time, toll-free for the first time. And Hough-The, the individual who lived in this home, by 1931 is when he moved in here, he was the person who was very instrumental in making that happen. And yeah, it might be kind of interesting in light of today's issues. And the other thing is, too, is Hough-The, in 28, he was no longer eligible to be a county commissioner. He only was allowed 2 terms. So he ran for county sheriff, and he ran against 2 other individuals. He ended up placing 3rd, and he lost by a total of 3,310 votes. So it looks like the community wasn't quite sure if he was ready to be a sheriff.
This house here on our left is it's a classic craftsman style house. And some of the features of a craftsman style house is these large porches with the large beams, the tapered beams that hold those large porches, This has a gable end on each end and very deep eaves. In some ways very similar to a bungalow, but this is called a craftsman house.
And we'll go and head back down this way, and we're going to take a look at a house on 20th. So this house is a provincial style home, and this house was built in 1923. And this is the Ryan house. Now, Ryan was a local dentist, Dr. A.P. Ryan, and his wife Amy built this house in 1923 to the design chosen in Ladies' Home Journal. That wasn't out of place at the time. During the 1920s and 30s, people began to be able to have kind of a Craftsman, Sears, style architecture that they could order in. Instead of having to have a specific architect design their home, they could get these model architecture designs that they could buy. Now, documentation on the house specifically notes that this was not built with hidden bricks, so I'm really sorry if anyone's disappointed. It's still a beautiful home. A number of the extended Ryan family made their homes in the Hough area. At one time, it said that no fewer than 8 properties in this neighborhood were owned by family members of the Ryan family. And Dr. Ryan practiced as a dentist for 44 years in Vancouver before retiring in 1954. He was an active and prominent member in the city, and he was the founder and on the board of the Vancouver Federal Savings and Loan, which we talked about Day Hilborn having designed. And Amy Ryan was the daughter of a Methodist pastor, and her father served in the Vancouver First Methodist Church from 1904 to 1907, and she married A.P. Ryan in 1910. And her parents were actually the prior owners of this property, and they sold the property to the newlywed couple so that they could build their home. So from here, we'll go ahead and we'll take a walk and look at our next site.
Well, actually, these two homes, I didn't do my homework before this tour, but I have researched these two homes, and they're the two that are across the street from each other, and they were owned by prominent business people. As you can tell by the size, I mean, these homes really stick out. It's ironic, throughout West Vancouver, the big, beautiful homes are always on the corner. Yeah. I don't know why they're on the corner, but they are, and I believe Durgan was one of the owners. When we do this again later this summer, I'll have the answers to that.
Yeah, and Durgan would have made sense because Durgan was a prominent family in Vancouver and in Washougal, and there are still Durgans in Washougal that are prominent in the community. So this is the Knapp house. And this house was the home of Russ G. Knapp, who was a prominent member of the Knapp family in the community and a local grocer, and he lived here until 1929. And Knapp moved west in 1909 to join the family business, which was undertaking, because the Knapps had a funeral home. And he joined his brother, William J. Knapp, in the business. And William actually was the one who eventually took over the family business and became the undertaker. Now, William was heavily involved in the community, and in August of 1908, William ran for county coroner, and he actually won election to that position. And in the first 2 years that William was county coroner, he ran into a couple interesting cases in his trade. The first case was of an individual that was up in Ridgefield. They said a stranger had came to Ridgefield, Washington, and that he was walking down the street and had passed some individuals, and when he had passed them, he had said that the mosquitoes were unbearable in the area up in Ridgefield. And the next count is that he went up to a local farmhouse, had knocked on the door and talked to them for a moment, and then he wasn't seen any longer after that. And then a day or so later, they ended up finding that the man had committed suicide. So William J. Knapp and the county sheriff actually came to the determination that the man had committed suicide because of the mosquitoes in the county. Now, whether that's true or not, it's quite interesting decision that Knapp made with the county sheriff. Now, the other instance, and again, it's kind of a grisly trade that Knapp was in, is Knapp actually had to encounter some quite dangerous situations in his business. What happened was up in Yakult, there was an individual who had went hunting, and he had ended up getting quite a large bear shot, which he was fine. Nothing happened with the bear. And he had told people in the town of Yakult that anyone who was willing could come up and have some of the bear meat. So there was an individual of 6 people who went and trekked up to get the bear meat, and a couple of them decided to stop and rest at one point. Well, one of the individuals woke up the next morning and he came and found that his friend had passed away in his sleep over the night. So he went back to town and someone had guarded the individual, and they called for Knapp and a couple individuals. And so Knapp had to trek up into the mountains of Yakult and make a makeshift sled to bring this person back down so that he could determine what had happened. And so the Knapp family had an interesting trade that they were involved in, and Rush was involved in this trade. However, in around 1911, or 1910, 1911, it seems that Rush got out of the trade. Now what happened is that Rush married his wife Lola Knapp. But the newspapers say that Rush had actually gotten an advantage on his brother, saying that he had married Lola without his brother knowing, and that it looks like William had originally been courting Lola, and Rush came in and married her quickly without letting William know, and ended up moving into this home with her.
So he was a claim jumper.
Yes. And you'll see the next year that Rush is no longer involved in the family business, but is running a grocery store with another individual. So is there a possibility that there was a family falling out over Lola, because Lola lived here until she passed away in the 40s? It's possible, and it's a quite interesting story to a quite interesting family that had a quite interesting trade in the local community. So from here, we'll go ahead and make our way down, and we'll go take a look at the school. And as we walk down this street, if you'll take a look on the right, you'll see a house that has the same brick pattern that we pointed out that's over on the church over here. And so it was quite popular in the 20s. And this is an interesting thing, because when you look at these bricks, you'll notice that some are darker and some are lighter colors. And that's due to the firing of the bricks themselves. Because what they do is they'll put them in the kiln extra long, and so they'll overfire the bricks, and so that you get this polychromatic look to the building where you have multiple colors. Instead of having to actually have different bricks of different colors, you just fire them for different periods. Yeah, the way that we've been able to find out when things are hidden bricks is because someone tells us they are. It's kind of difficult to identify always when the hidden bricks were used. But there's a good chance there is, because Ken can talk about a little bit about the hidden operation up here. And this home, as we're walking by, I'll just mention, was a home of a retired Army officer with the last name of Zimmerman.
You know, when we first started talking about the Hiddens and their brickyard, obviously they started back in the 1870s, and the brickyard was kind of kitty corner from the museum, and that was the pit. Well, obviously when they sold the pit, they needed to go someplace else to get the clay. Well, this was their second pit, was this whole area here, this block that this school sits on. Well, they got lots of clay out of this pit, and eventually they moved up to 27th and Kaufman. And in fact, one of the Hiddens said that there's a vein of clay that starts there at the museum, angles through Vancouver, through this spot, and ends up at 27th and Kaufman, and actually ends up at about 34th and Fruit Valley Road. So he claims that this was the path for the Columbia River at one time, thousands of years ago, and that's why you had this layer of real fine silt that we use for brick making. Now, when the school district was looking at building another school, and I was just talking to the lady in the back here about her sister went to this school. There were only a couple of schools down below us. I think they were both on Franklin or nearby. And so they were looking at other property. Well, the Hiddens agreed to sell all these lots to the school district for $250 a lot, which was a bargain. The only downside to it, you had to look down into the lots because this was a big pit. So the Vancouver schools, they sucked up that offer right now, and then they had to bring in about $800 worth of fill material to build this up before they could build the school.
So not too bad. So this school was built in 1941, and this was built by another prominent architect, Donald Stewart. who was a local citizen in the community, and he actually designed the Garfield Auditorium, which is out in Camas, Washington. And now this school was named after Paddy Hough, and he was a local educator. And Paddy's story, he taught for several years in his native Ireland, and he actually joined the hospital corps during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And that's where he lost his forearm. He was helping remove soldiers from the field, and a bomb exploded, and he lost his left forearm in that explosion. And upon his recovery, he was asked to come to British Columbia to teach, and then he spent there about 13 years doing that. And after that time, he went and moved to Seattle. And unfortunately, it said because of his credentials or lack thereof, he was not able to secure a position in Seattle. However, he did tell people that the bed bugs were so horrible in Seattle that he felt he would just keep moving south down to Vancouver. So credentials or bed bugs, you're never quite sure. So as the story's told, he left because of the bed bugs, and he was offered the headmaster job at the private St. James Academy, and then was made principal of the Columbia School in 1891. And in 1899, he took the same position at Vancouver High School. Now, Paddy lived a very simple, modest life with his wife, and never really did anything extravagant or anything of that sort. And so it's quoted in an article that we have in the museum that when his will was read, all could understand why throughout the years the wonderful man had gone in threadbare cloth, why the old hat, the old shoes, the old umbrella, why he had never gone on pleasure trips. All that remained of his estate after him and his wife's passing was to be given to the building and financing of an agricultural school outside of some incorporated city. Now, I've yet to be able to find what that was exactly, but it just shows the individual who this neighborhood's named after, who this school's named after, the passion he had for education, that he wanted to donate all that he had saved for his life to the continuing education of the youth of Vancouver and Clark County. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and head back to the museum, but I want to thank everyone for taking the walk today and seeing the sights of the beautiful and wonderful and historic Hough neighborhood.